Hi, welcome back. Part 3. We're going to be talking about identity, new social movements and the environment. As you can imagine, there's been a number of rapid developments in technology, particularly in the last 30 years, that really have defined an epoch, really have defined an age, a digital age. And it's hand in glove with these rapid developments in technology have been the networks and the pathways and the ability to communicate these technologies have afforded us. Multiple modes of communication, in multiple mediums of communication are available to us now that just didn't exist even 20 years ago. There's been a haphazard sort of adoption of various types of communication tools and technology. There's been a bit of a staccato pattern to what types of technology or communications are adopted by the majority of people before that becomes entrenched and a new type of technology comes about. And that cycle of going from technology to technology has been accelerating, certainly of late. A lot of these types of technologies that are facilitating this networked communication often take the shape nowadays of software. A lot of the hardware technological developments had happened a little while ago, as we can see the evolution of the smartphone, for example. Now the developments really are around software, and I'm talking particularly around apps, in particular communication apps, that are speeding up the rate of which new connections and new networks can be formed. AI particularly and big data are sort of, they're precipitating that change into a more networked environment where often people are being connected in ways that is being directed by big data. The decisions are often made by algorithmic changes, inside apps as well as just inside technology platforms and software. So the rapid change, particularly in comms, has allowed these so-called disruptor industries, these disruptor platforms to come in and to displace traditional industries. Uber with taxi driving, for example, the enormous rise in food delivery services. Things of this nature come in and shake up what was traditionally there. In the case of the taxi industry, for example, their business model was almost broken overnight. It was replaced by a decentralized cohort of people that were doing the same job as them, but relying on a platform technology instead of the apparatuses that they had in these old, slow networks of formalized taxi companies and things like that. Equally, it must be said, it has given rise to the ease with which social movements can coalesce, particularly at that point of the cycle, and to bureaucratize. Networking is one thing, but solidifying and consolidating those networks with social movement organisations is something that tech does very well. Anti-globalisation social movements are a good example to look at this, insofar as people all over the world in different time zones, thousands and thousands of kilometres away from each other, can be working simultaneously on achieving the same kinds of ends. And you see this in technology as well as otherwise. But it's important to note that, as Weber was theorising way back in the day, rapid change driven by tech has excluded people, not just the taxi industries of the world, but what has replaced a lot of that decentralised platform industry that has displaced the taxi industry, for example, has ramifications for the people that work for those platforms. Ostensibly, they are independent contractors rather than employee, a very important distinction when you're talking about their working rights. Food delivering platforms are similarly subjected to a lot of criticism for how they treat people that work for them that are not considered employees, including not just their take-home wage, but their safety. Who's responsible for that? A lot of this is sort of fomenting so-called losers in this industry. This rapid change is leading to anomie. It's leading to people feeling challenged and overcome with the speed with which the changes are occurring, as well as the personal ramifications of being displaced out of an industry or losing working rights as a result. This social change essentially turns to a kind of malaise in some cases and fear in other cases. There's an apathetic approach to seeing what's happening on a massive scale in society. These feelings of anomie, but there's also a genuine concern there, and this is shared by a number of different people. So I think that when we're talking about networks, particularly tech, and this disruption that's occurring, what we're also talking about here is people's identity. And so Manuel Castells, who's probably been the most preeminent in talking about these changes, these networks of hope and outrage, as he calls them, is that you've got these sort of complementary forces of technology and networks that are operating to disrupt things that can be harnessed by social movements for progressive change, but can also be used by these disruptors that can suppress wages, drive down safety, make people more insecure and lead to fear. And Castells, when he's talking about these identities, really sort of boils this down to there's three sort of spheres in which these identities fall into. They're legitimating ones, they're resisting identities, and they're project identities, they're progressive identities. Legitimating identities in Castells' theorising is essentially the moderating ones. There's a recognition from government and corporations that there is this fomentation that's happening in society. People are fearful, people are worried, but it's okay. Everything's going to be all right. Let's maintain our job security by this method and this method and this method. Does it address the problem? Possibly not in a comprehensive way, but the identity from government and the sort of shibboleths of the corporate world are there to say, yes, change is occurring, we recognise that people are going to be impacted, but it's okay. As you can see from the image that I've popped up there, I think that what I've noticed, particularly in my research about this sort of legitimating identity from corporations, is that they adopt this sort of like sassy insouciance in their communications, as is sort of manifested in this email from this tweet from Wendy's, who is notorious for adopting this quite sassy sort of approach. But at its heart, they're a burger chain in America. They want to sell burgers. So to do that, they're adopting a kind of identity. They're putting forward a projection of what they want to do. Yes, like here's McDonald's, our traditional rival, etc., etc., etc. The second type of identity that Castells talks about is that group of people that have been either personally or indirectly affected by this change. Their feelings of anomie, their apathy and fear have set in, and their identity is structured around the fact that they need to push back against the change that's occurring. They need to minimise the impact on their own lives and on others' lives close to them. They often speak about how it's impacting their family and themselves, and they seek reassurance from what has often gone quite a long time in the past. you see people idealising the 1940s and 50s and 60s, where post-war prosperity and secure income, which is what they are craving, is becoming idealised and valorised as the future for these people, and that there's a strong resistance against these sort of legitimating identities from government about things being all right. Their catch cry often is things are definitely not all right. The third type of identity that Castells is identifying is one that's sort of tends to push even further. So they've been exposed to the technology and the networks, and they've been exposed to this sort of level of disruption, often in whole industries and in society, and they seek to shake that even further. They seek to disrupt it even further to the point that a sort of idealised future that they have planned and that they have set up for society as a whole can be implemented in its place, and that the level of dismantling and undoing of the inequalities, particularly that are occurring in the current society, can be replaced with their preferred model, and as their tools, that's usually technology, and their networks that are bringing that forward. It's bringing together what we know about new social movements and bringing together the sort of the disparate parts of a progressive identity that Castells talk about. The environmental movement is a really good example of this, simply because it's just so very broad. To be an environmentalist can mean so many different things. It can mean the real world and localised push to save a certain species. It can often result. I'm sorry, my throat got the better of me. We're talking about the environmental movement, and I was reflecting on how broad it was. That it can be as specific as saving a particular skink in a very localised part of the world, to talking about the reduction of plastic waste and waste more generally by legislating that manufacturers can only use a certain type of product packaging. There's the economic sphere that's being targeted by the environmental movement. There's the political sphere that's being targeted. There's the environmental sphere that's being targeted. There are older, more established organisations that live within the environmental movement that have bureaucratised, in Bloomer's sort of model of coalescing into bureaucratisation, that are bureaucratised to the stage where they are stable, they are large, they are advocacy organisations with broad appeal. But the very nature that they have organised to the stage that they have, critics within the environmental movement can point to their lack of nimbleness and ability for specific actions that they choose to go ahead with. There can also be contention inside the environmental movement about the tactics that are employed by a bigger, more established organisation, and the resources that they do or sometimes do not lend to sister organisations, often smaller, that are employing tactics that the larger organisations choose not to pursue. There's tensions within the movement, and there's tensions between individuals within the very organisations. So you can see that from even a broad area of our lived experience, in terms of the environment movement, has very, very complex parts within it that encapsulate a lot of people. General surveying of the population about the importance that should be placed on nature and the environment is very, very high, but it can be very, very low when talking to subgroups of society or specific issues within society. And so there's a lot of groups that are merging, they're using these networks and this technology to coalesce around a particular idea. They've got a very specific thing that they need or that they wish to have changed, and they're going to do that through disruptive action of their own. So there's actually an increase in social movements and organisation. There's also they become more numerous, and there can also be a lot more merging in between them. They're taking on different viewpoints. They've got particular economic targets or political targets and tactics that are associated within it. And that these organisations then start to become a bit of a proxy for the ontological arguments that are happening inside the environmental movement, where organisations that profess the same sorts of goals, for example, start to exhibit a little bit of antagonism towards one another because of the tactics that they choose to employ, or the priorities that different types of organisations place on things. It starts to define the organisational identity, and it starts to define the individuals who associate with those types of social movements. So going to the project identity as a whole, there's tensions within that. There's these struggles for meaning. Sometimes whole world views are clashing within these types of organisational struggles within the same social movement. And I think the reason that we're talking about the environment and it's so apposite is that we're dealing with a climate emergency. There's no real discussion and discourse anymore about whether this is occurring or not. And where it does exist, they're small pockets with their own sort of political outlooks. But within the environment movement, there's these types of tensions that can be inherent in pluralistic sort of movements really comes to the fore because of the urgency of action that is required and the totality of the actions that are needed for society. There's this tension can sometimes emerge not just necessarily within organisations and between organisations, but between individuals. And so I think that it's a climate change particularly is sort of like the great leveller within the environmental movement, but within that access to action is equally stymied, and that there can be a tension even within the organisations that are ostensibly pulling in the same direction. I think what's emerging more and more, and something that we can be quite optimistic about within the environmental movement, is that more and more environmental justice is now associated with an economic restructuring. So the networks that were created to sort of dismantle and disrupt and that are associated with the project ID are now sort of being inverted into a positive. The economic realignment and restructuring of our economies along environmental justice lines is what is more and more being understood as a benchmark for going forward, and that the change that is needed within our cultural and our political outset is starting to coalesce around environmental values, and the social values and the environmental values that used to be in opposition are now they're now running alongside one another. They're now more closely associated with another. And as you'll see in the next section, these big sort of social questions and elements are tackling what used to be a sort of a sharp binary, which is that these things are happening in the social sphere and these things are happening in the natural world, but they're both sort of social facts. They're affecting us and they're affecting people in the same sort of way. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.